Hello, everyone. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. Want to welcome you to May's Exchange Call. First and foremost, we could not do these without sponsorship. So a very special thank you to our sponsor, Modern Miracle Network, the executive director of which is one of our panelists today, Michael Binnion. So I can send a thank you to him personally. Thank you also to our outstanding panelists who we will get to shortly. A couple of quick housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, we are going to let the chat function run today. The usual reminder that we will remove anyone posting rude or objectionable comments. The chat is for commentary and it's also for networking. Hopefully there should be a drop-down box in the chat. Look for it. If someone posts an interesting comment and you want to talk to them personally or introduce yourself or connect, you should be able to do that in the drop-down box in the chat. The Q&A box is for questions, and our moderator, Danielle, who we'll introduce in a second, will have a look in that as we move on over the next while to check in on those questions. Second, if you have suggestions on future topics, please connect through our website or email directly at troy@canadastrongandfree.network. I'll have Zoe put my email address into the chat. We are doing a second exchange call this month. We usually just do one a month. But by popular demand on May 26th, we are having another discussion on COVID, getting to a fear-free COVID recovery. Again, that's May 26th, details to follow. Finally, this Zoom call will be recorded and posted on our website 2 hours after the call. So with that, I will turn it over for the next hour, maybe an hour and 10. We'll see how the discussion's going a little bit over the top to our moderator today, Danielle Smith, who is president now. She's landed at a place, the Alberta Enterprise Group, but of course also speaks and writes and moderates on many topics and is very much a friend of the conservative movement across Canada. By the way, related to this topic, Danielle interviewed international best-selling author Michael Shellenberger last month as part of our conference. I've been teasing out all of that content from the conference, and I just posted yesterday that interview, and I'll ask Zoe to put that into the chat as well as a link for you. Very, very good interview. It goes for 25 minutes. I encourage everyone to check it out. Okay, enough from me. And with that, I turn it over to Danielle Smith. Thank you so much for doing this, Danielle, to lead our panel.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for letting me do this, Troy. I always feel like I've got the primo panels and the primo guests that you let me interview. So as Troy mentioned, I'm president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. And I think it's relevant for me to mention that because I've been talking to our members over the last month. And when we were brainstorming for this conference, we were wondering, what's the question that our audience is going to ask? And we figured the one of the top questions would be, why do we have to do anything about carbon dioxide anyway? And I'll tell you, I'm hoping that we can kind of get into the mind frame that this whole panel has gotten into and what I've discovered my members have gotten into. I mean, I do have a member, two members who are in the concrete business, and they're looking for a way to become net zero on their concrete. We do have another member in the plastics industry who's looking at a way to become net zero on plastics. So it seems like almost every conversation I have, business owners are trying to find a way to get to solutions. Now we've got so many great takes on this. What I love about this issue as we're talking about reducing emissions is now everybody's in the conversation. It used to be just wind and solar, but on our panel today, we've got a representative from the Nuclear Association. We've got a representative who's in the biofuels area. We'll be talking about hydrogen, but we're going to start off talking to Michael Binnion, who has already been mentioned, is the executive director of the Modern Miracle Network. The Modern Miracle, of course, being fossil fuels and how they've greatly improved our quality of life and fuel our entire economy. But he recently conducted a panel discussion on the issue of carbon capture and turning that carbon dioxide into a range of useful products. So we're going to start off by going through and having 5 to 7 minutes from each of our panelists. We'll also have Kathrine Ryengen, who I'd mentioned is in the hydrogen business. Andrea Kent is former president of the Renewables Industry Canada, and Steve Coupland is with the Canadian Nuclear Association. They'll each have 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will get into a panel discussion. I will be monitoring the Q&A, so feel free to send your questions as we go along, and I'll take note of them as we go. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Michael Binnion to talk about carbon capture, and he is, of course, with the Modern Miracle Network. Michael, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, and and thank you very much for having me, and Troy for introducing that we're a sponsor. Of course, when you're a sponsor, you get to speak on these panels, and I get to be on with such a great group of people for doing that. What Modern Miracle Network, we were formed to to create a reasoned discussion about hydrocarbons in Canada. And what I really want to talk about today is the idea to reframe the energy transition issue from where we are now, which is, I think, a place that, you know, you just can't get there from here. You have to choose between human progress and the environment, the way the current problem has been framed. And I'd like to reframe this energy transition issue as a problem that we actually can solve. And so really what I'm thinking about is the idea of that we rethink transition as not a transitioning off of hydrocarbons, but an actual transition of our energy diet and a transition of hydrocarbons to an energy choice that I think with existing technology, and I'll talk about this briefly, with existing technology can already be a fully sustainable fuel with zero emissions. And I think that's the part that a lot of people are not really understanding, is how far that technology has come. And so part of this is then to realize that the discussion that we've been having around climate models, you know, are they accurate? Are they not accurate? Are the Paris goals the right ones or the wrong ones? Has really taken us away from what I think is the real problem. And the real problem, I think, is that we have very likely projections that will have 30% more people. So think about 7.5 billion people to something like 10 billion people by 2050, but a more than doubling of GDP. Now, this of course assumes we don't completely screw up this whole discussion of energy transition, but if we can get it right, then we should have a more than doubling of GDP, 30% more people. This is a dramatic change in economic activity and people on the earth. And so the issue there, and Joe Oliver talks about this, I think, quite well when he talks about extreme weather. Let's say weather doesn't change at all between now and 2050. In the next 30 years, it turns out the climate models were all wrong. The weather's not changing at all. Extreme weather is exactly the same. But if we have double the GDP and 30% more people living in coastal areas or in forests or in vulnerable areas, extreme weather will still be a bigger problem. It's baked in. So if we think about that we have a problem of more people and more GDP, then we have an environmental problem to deal with, even if the climate models are wrong. Or as one environmentalist, Ngo, put it to me, oh, look at this, it's 2050. It turns out the climate models were wrong. Oh, darn, we saved the world for nothing. So if we reframe this as an issue of population and growth and economy, how do we maintain human progress? And how do we continue to improve the environment? Then I think there's a problem that we can solve. And I also think if we don't come up with private market-based solutions for that problem of population growth and bigger environmental problems, then people will go along with the big global government solutions that are on offer, because it's the only solution on offer. And I don't think we're going to convince people that population growth and GDP growth is not an issue, because I think it is an issue. So I want to just talk a little bit about how I changed my mind on this. And it's a story, a Dutch filmmaker was really quite interesting. He called me from Los Angeles, California. He said, I want you to be in my documentary. And I went, oh, it's about time, right? So of course I agreed to the meeting right away. And he came to my office. Well, it was quite clear within about the first 60 seconds, the film wasn't actually about me. So that was a bit of disappointment for me. But what it was about was Suzanne West from Imagineer. And she had this idea that you could produce hydrocarbons, oil and gas, with zero emissions, which I said, well, that's ridiculous. We all know that's not possible. And so, you know, he wanted me be in the film to be the person that was as I felt every good story needs a hero and a villain. It seemed clear that he was casting me as the villain, and I was going to be the one who said this wasn't possible. But I started to look into it, and what I realized was that it actually is possible if you can get zero emissions energy. And we actually made a project in Quebec where we have access to hydro in my for-profit life at Quest Energy for zero emissions production of natural gas. And we've engineered that all with, to my surprise, existing technologies. I've now started to move into the idea, well, if we can produce it without emissions, why can't we consume it without emissions? And that's been the new journey that we're on right now. And I want to just give a bit of a shout out to Ngos, who I fight with all the time. So don't think that these people are all necessarily my best friends. But I want to give them the shout out. If they hadn't have pushed on these issues, I never would have thought about this. I never would have thought about, can we do zero emissions production or zero emissions consumption? And what I've discovered is I think it is possible with existing technology. And so I think the solution to the problem that I framed at the beginning is what I'm calling this and I'm not calling it. This is an emerging thing that you can find on the internet, the circular economy. What I've coined is the 3 R's of a full circular economy, which is that we reduce and we recycle or we return emissions under the ground. And the technologies are out there. I just did the panel that Danielle said. We've had people, we have somebody on the panel right here who's talking about making hydrogen and creating industrial quality CO2 from it. You'll hear from her shortly after me. But you can already today make out of carbon dioxide, ethanol, methanol, propanol, calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, fertilizer, ethylene, concrete, cement, carbon nanotubes, hand sanitizer, and my personal favorite, vodka. The vodka, by the way, if we get this all screwed up on the energy transition, we're going to need that. So we're glad to know we can do it without emissions. The other thing just to point out is Mother Nature does a great job of recycling carbon, and Mother Nature already recycles carbon into all of those products, but a lot of other interesting things like people and living and life. I mean, this is a natural cycle. What we're really talking about is accelerating that cycle and people doing it ourselves as opposed to waiting for Mother Nature. So just in conclusion, I'm thinking if we can reframe this problem as population, GDP, environmental impacts, and that it's about maintaining human progress while we reduce those impacts in spite of a growing population, then we have a solvable problem with innovation. And we can maintain human progress and we can maintain environmental progress. And we just need market solutions, not big government to get us there. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Michael. Let me just ask one question before I move on to hydrogen, because I know in that panel discussion, you kind of teased out, what does the price of carbon need to be to make these technologies marketable, worthwhile? And I think you've got a pretty good answer to that, because I think we are all looking at carbon dioxide or carbon pricing going up to $170 per ton and kind of freaking out about that. Does it need to be higher than that? Is the break even lower than that? What'd you discover?
Yeah, so the people that we had on the panel, and I've probably met with about 15 different people with different technologies, with 5 on that panel. One of them says, we're right there today, we don't need any carbon credits. And I think it's going to be like everything, it's going to be a curve. You know, the higher the carbon credit, and I think we do need to look at providing market incentives to some of these technologies, but the higher the carbon credit, the more the technologies become commercial. I think the cutoff is between 0, where some of these technologies think they're commercial. Already today, we can produce concrete from CO2, and we can do it with 0 carbon credits. You know, that's the one end, 0. The other end, I think, is the cost of capture and storage. Because if people say, well, I need $500 a ton to make vodka, for example, well, people might say, well, I think I'd rather pay what's already less than $100 to capture it and store it. So I think we've got and the people on their panel, they were all targeting to make their technologies commercial at $100 or less. That was a common target. So somewhere between 0 and 100 seems to be the number, and some of them are already there today.
All right, one more question before I leave to go on to some of the other technologies. Someone's asking what the chemistry is to burn natural gas without emissions. Is that something that Kathrine will get into, or are you able to comment on that, Michael?
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. Let's go back to the reduce, recycle, and return. So if we decide to use the natural gas as just a pure fuel, just like we do right now, then I'm saying, okay, well, let's reduce, like my company is, we'll produce the natural gas with 0 emissions. So there's less emissions to start with before you even get it. Then as you burn it, you'll create the CO2. But if we can capture that CO2, for example, in an industrial quality CO2, like Kathrine's about to talk about, it can feed into it can now be recycled into concrete, nanotubes, or vodka, if you want to go with my personal favorite. And then any CO2, you say, hey, you know what, we just can't recycle all of it because it's not economic to do it yet. Great, well then we'll take that and we'll put it back. That's the return part. So reduce, recycle, return 100% of the emissions means that we're now real 0. We're not using carbon offsets. We're just capturing, we're just taking a full circular economy approach to this, that those emissions, to the extent they don't get reduced or recycled, end up returned under the ground.
Awesome. All right. Now people are going to wonder where to get that vodka. It's called Air Company. If you want to look at it online, they not only make vodka, but they make hand sanitizer. And I guess it also passed some blind taste tests. So people didn't even know that it was made from carbon dioxide and they thought it was pretty good stuff. Thanks for that, Michael. Let's go on to, I think that our next guest follows sort of naturally on what Michael had said. Kathrine Ryengen is with Zen Power Norway, and she's going to tell us a little bit what their innovations are in the hydrogen space, which we are hearing so much about. Kathrine, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today. As per your introduction, SEG Power is a Norwegian company that has existed since 2008, and we have developed technology to enable clean utilization of natural gas resources. And the way we do this is the innovation that enables so-called integrated carbon capture, basically transforming natural gas to a clean hydrogen and capturing the CO2 as part of that process. And back to also Michael's point, this technology enhances the overall efficiency in the process due to the fact that we are capturing the CO2 in the technology. So you don't get a penalty, rather you get a benefit from capturing the CO2 as part of the process. As I mentioned, this enables clean utilization of natural gas in the way that you are left with two separate gas streams, basically. One is pure and clean hydrogen that can be utilized locally or exported, enabling basically a new business for natural gas or owners of natural gas resources, nations or private companies, that is. And the other stream that is being separated out is a CO2, pure CO2 stream that can either be utilized, as was mentioned before, or if the aim is to achieve a clean hydrogen, then you need to store it, basically. So that can be discussed whether to use or store it based on local needs, demands, or wishes for the owner of that technology. Now, SEG Power was founded on the principle that we wanted to enable and enhance efficiency. So this green aspect was later, more in focus, but that was not the initial focus. As I mentioned, that was more a benefit to achieve this enhanced efficiency in the system. Now, today, this green aspect of the technology is certainly the main feature, I would say, and something that is being strongly supported by the strong development, I would say, in the market the last couple of years in specific, both related to the clean energy transition, but also related to specifically hydrogen and CO2 capture, which is both the markets that we are exposed to. Also supported by a number of new studies lately showing that both so-called blue hydrogen but also green hydrogen is needed in order to enable this major energy transition that we basically need to do in order to achieve the goals both in EU that are very specific and Norway being very close to the EU. We're very interested in what their thinking is, but also globally, obviously. So our initial focus has been in EU, but now recently also looking at Canada and potential then joint project with Kathrine in Canada, that we are very interested in further exploring how to utilize those natural gas resources in a clean way. The SEG concept also includes clean utilization of biogas resources that actually also can enable so-called negative CO2 footprint. We call it Climate Plus solutions or SEG Climate Plus solutions, and that is also part of the solution achieving a net zero carbon economy as per the Paris goals. So having solutions in both clean hydrogen but also Climate Plus solutions are important to SEG. Now we are in the midst of the upscaling and commercialization of this technology. We have full focus on the project on the west coast of Norway, literally next to the Northern Lights project, which is one of the world's first CO2 deposits. So that's where we will demonstrate the full advantages of the technology, and then we'll take this wonderful technology out in the world in order to make a contribution to the energy transition. I think just to round off, I think it's very important for a company like EXCH in order to succeed that there will be a strong development in the regulations supporting green technologies, and which we are seeing very evident now lately. So we're very happy, obviously, to see this development, and hopefully it will just emphasis in strength going forward. So again, very excited about the supporting environment for this technology, and we're happy to answer any questions you would have related to the company EXCH Power or our technology or our projects in Norway or in Canada or other places.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that, Kathrine. Troy reminded me as we were all talking about this in the setup that some terminology that's really commonly used in your field might not be well understood. Like we seem to be now labeling hydrogen. There's gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. And I almost feel like they're doing that to say one is better than the other. Whereas it strikes me, if you do zero emissions hydrogen, it's all zero emissions hydrogen. Can you talk about those distinctions and what they actually mean for those who aren't familiar with the term?
Yes, no, I think, and you're right. Hydrogen only, basically, it's a molecule. So these colors are a bit inventive. Many of us would say. We operate in both the green and the blue aspects, depending on which gas you use, if it's biogas or if it's a natural gas. But that aside, what has been developing over the last year is EU specifically focusing on what they call the EU Taxonomy, with the focus of actually classifying technologies based on the CO2 footprint or the content of CO2 basically in the hydrogen produced specifically. So now, and this is a big, this is a very good thing, we believe, because then it's getting less what you call political and more fact-based, which we are very concerned about. So basically each of these production technologies now basically need to do the calculations and show how much CO2, kilo CO2 per kilo hydrogen produced, and what that needs to be below a certain threshold, which is 3 kilo CO2 per kilo hydrogen produced. So now we're getting into again very fact-oriented area, which makes it equal for everyone to compare basically. And we think this is a great advantage because, as you say, it's been a debate lately, and it has, in our opinion, been very affected by who has the strongest voice more than perhaps facts in many cases.
All right, one more question before I go on to our next topic is on the issue of scalability and also CO2 storage. So can you talk a little bit about when you're storing CO2, what does that mean precisely? Where are you storing it? And just give us some sense of how scalable your technology is. Maybe you'll have a better idea once you finish your project, but can you comment on both of those?
Yeah, no, so the technology is scalable, and this is a technology that is part of the so-called family of reforming technologies, which today are large scale. It's a type of hydrogen today. 98% of all hydrogen today is so-called gray hydrogen. It's basically produced from gas, but without CO2 capture. The reason why 98% or literally all hydrogen today is gas-based is due to the lower cost. It's just a lower cost or way of producing hydrogen due to major scale effects. Basically being because it's a volume technology. If you increase the diameter in a tank, you increase the capacity manifold. And you cannot achieve the same scalability through electrolysis, which is the other way of doing it. So we are part of that family. So it's not a question whether it's scalable. It's more to do the steps and basically prove it. So we are on that road. When it comes to the CO2 capture and storage, obviously it's outside. The storage part is outside our scope. So we're very happy to see that strong development that has happened over the years, and not least the Northern Lights project in Norway. It's basically not anything new about it. It has happened for many, many years. In Norway, we've done storage for over 20 years. So it's basically a question of finding the right formation, geological wise, in order for it not to leak, basically. But this has been happening already many places around the world, and certainly in Norway for 20 years. And what is interesting now is to see that this whole business is getting commercial. So basically that you get commercial models around the CO2 as a service. So you see companies now popping up that are basically solving the transportation and storage kind of challenge for companies that are doing the job of capturing the CO2. So this is a very interesting development, and certainly helping companies such as SEG in order to be able to roll out that technology more broadly, and not necessarily need to be connected to a CO2 deposit facility.
All right. Fantastic. Kathrine, thanks so much for that explanation. That was Kathrine Ryengen, who's with ZEG Power in Norway. We're going on to our next topic. Remember, what we're discussing today is beyond Paris and the carbon tax, market solutions to global challenges. So when I first saw the name of our next guest, Andrea Kent's organization, she's former president of Renewables Industry Canada, I thought, okay, this is when we're going to be talking about wind and solar. Well, that's not what we're going to talk about. So she's going to tell us a little bit about the biofuels area and how it fits into what we've been discussing so far. Andrea, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's really interesting when you look at what renewable means. I think there is still kind of, a conception or even maybe a little bit of a bias towards wind and solar, but fuel absolutely can be renewable. And kind of like what Michael was saying at the beginning, we know that liquid transportation fuel can be renewable because it already is. And that really is kind of the modern biofuels story. And looking, at the Canadian market specifically, it's a great story. So I'm really happy to be able to participate here today. Looking at Paris, more and more countries are just kind of jumping on that bandwagon, and I don't say bandwagon in a bad way. I think a lot of people would see that there is a lot of business opportunity that comes with setting the stage for targets and putting in some goalposts. And look at the panel that we're having here today and some of these technologies, right? Like this is a seizable moment for Canada to take. But I think that we also have to be really, really practical about it and looking at policies that we already can assess and build off of as part of this beyond Paris, and getting out of just kind of the think bubble around carbon prices specifically, and making some great action here happen for us from a GDP perspective as well. Biofuels has a really great case study when you look at market-based policy and what it can do. And where I think, how I define and kind of put, that into a characterized box is, from a policy perspective, is it very, very clear what the objective is and what it is seeking to accomplish? Can we measure that in a way that is business relevant and can be commercialized easily, and everybody kind of gets to win in that new economy? And then finally, how much is it going to cost? So do we know what it's going to do? Is there a way for businesses to play in and turn this into an advantage? And ultimately, is it fair to consumers as well too? Is there room for consumers to be able to partake? And looking at the biofuels market-based policy story, I think it can kind of outline that in a way that's helpful. And it is also, kind of a mix of what Michael and Kathrine were saying, right? It empowers existing fuels and technology against this environmental target setting, but also accelerates the new things that we know we are going to need, and frankly, that we're capable of doing here. So why wouldn't we seize the opportunity for things like Real Zero and reducing the carbon footprint and getting into these markets? So around 2000, mid to late 2000s, around 2010, Canada's first national biofuels mandate was put in place by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. It was an economic policy, it was an agriculture policy. It ended up being really, really great for the environment, but it was done in a way that was intended to create some market opportunities for farmers and to also, extend our petroleum supply and our diesel supply by introducing some blended renewables. When you look at, kind of what biofuels are, we're using them today. So presuming a lot of people here, like me, drive a gasoline powered passenger vehicle. Every time I fill up, I probably have about a 7% blend of ethanol already in the diesel pool. So for your diesel trucks and heavier vehicles on road transportation, there's a requirement for 5%. And that has been really successful in doing certain things. So, I mean, it was volume based. We knew that the fuels were going to also have a good environmental impact. It built out a domestic industry by de-risking the investments and creating a stable market condition for the renewable fuel, biofuels additives. It attracted innovation. So not only did Canadian producers put shovels in ground and start employing people, and today the annual economic activity is $3.5 billion. But it also put in place conditions to continue to innovate as well too. And looking at what government is seeking to build out now builds on those volume requirements for ethanol blended in gasoline and biomass-based diesel blended in diesel, as well as opening it up to other low carbon solutions, right? So looking at hydrogen, looking at some other, compliance options for reducing the carbon in fossil fuel. And it also creates some conditions where, whether it's through credit trading or whether it is through some other pricing mechanisms, does allow innovation and for scalability to kind of have that bump it needs to become in the market. And also, it's not just renewable fuels producers who are, dedicated, like a biodiesel plant or an ethanol plant who are, contributing here. It's also integrated into oil and gas companies as well, right? So I think that the conversation and what happens when you kind of get out of the, principle-based think bubble and start looking at the market proper, you realize that, these are fuel solutions that, you and I are probably using on a personal basis as a consumer, create great conditions for specialized domestic producers, and that growth trajectory is continuing now. And also existing fossil fuel blenders and producers also are seizing kind of the opportunity and looking at it. And that, de-risking element is absolutely important to keep, our assets anchored here, to ensure that we don't, kind of become stranded and we can continue to benefit off of the fuel infrastructures that we built. But really going from a volume, liters and gallon business into a carbon-based business, can work and is working. And a lot of, the biofuel producers today are employing some of the things that, the earlier panelists talked about as well, right? So looking at ways to either reduce the carbon footprint of impacts that go into our products. So agricultural innovation, making sure that, our great farming practices for the plants that we use or the waste recovery processes that we use continue to compete on carbon and innovate, which is great news. But also too, right, looking at larger markets down the road. I read it a lot that, looking at, 2030, the bulk of how we're going to meet any of those emissions targets that are being set under Paris right now is going to come from existing fuels and existing technology. So, really, really taking the momentum that that gives us, and then, continuing to unlock new potentials, like some of the things that Michael and Kathrine are talking about are also being done at biofuels production facilities. So I think that's really exciting. So hopefully, that's kind of the playbook here, and absolutely happy to, answer any questions anyone might have.
Perfect, Andrea. Let me ask this question, because Michael sort of framed out where we're going with a 30% increase in population and an increase in GDP. I guess there's always been a concern that, are we producing products that we should be using for food, and instead we're using it for fuel? And you already connected with me a way in which biofuels are made from a waste product of restaurant industries. For instance, they've got to do something with their fryer fat, and that can then be cycled into biofuels. So that's actually using it twice, once to feed people and then the second time to create fuels. Can you just give us a few more examples so that people know that we're not crowding out food production as we're producing more biofuels?
Absolutely. And, this answer is a Canada answer because we're fortunate here, right? We have a bounty, a literal abundance of the plants, and a lot of, things like the wheat out west, or, I'm from Ontario, southwestern Ontario, right? So Canada's Corn Belt. We have, so much corn and so much canola that we actually export a lot of it, right? So that's not the same for every country, but it certainly is part of the Canadian modern biofuel story, is that, between our agriculture practices and the abundance of resources that we have more than ample plant-based resources to, put into a whole bunch of different markets where it makes sense. Animal feed, food prices, they're pretty disconnected from ethanol prices, and certainly it's not an either or scenario there. But waste, right? So there's a restaurant actually behind my house that you can't see, but I walk past one of those recycled waste recycling bins that I think that you were mentioning as well too. So that waste product from used cooking oil can be collected, and that then becomes a fuel. Right? Looking at not just, process enhancements, but what we can use as a new input. So, a lot of work is already underway and has been for years, looking at, sustainable biofuels, looking at unlocking the potential of municipal waste to fuels, right? And there's a couple of plants that are looking at doing that already. Market-based policies allow them to commercialize much, much better and much, much sooner. And I think if you look around the world as well too, and our neighbor to the US has got the same kind of, crop advantages and has the same philosophy as we do on this. So it isn't the same everywhere around the world, but, certainly we have to use what we have and be the most resourceful that we can do. And biofuels is a big way to do that here in Canada.
And just one more question before we move on to the nuclear discussion. People are always wondering, would these things be happening if there wasn't government regulation, like the clean fuel standards, or government subsidies? I don't know if that's a scenario in your business, but can you talk a little bit about that? Does it make economic sense to be adding ethanol into the existing stream of fuels?
Yeah, so if we look at, subsidies is always interesting. Biofuels producers and, the ethanol industry in Canada has not been subsidized for almost a decade, right? There are other parts of the fuel economy that are subsidized, either because they're new and emerging technology, or frankly, because they always have, right? Fossil fuel subsidies still exist, but that's part of the market mechanism there. But subsidies for biofuels producers are a thing of the past. They worked because they kind of allowed us to get the financing that we needed to build out initial production facilities. A lot of that de-risking, either for additional capacity or for add-ons for new technologies, and getting to that real zero mindset, will now come through probably repayable grants. The government has announced a bunch, and actually provinces also of all stripes have done this. But also from just the clean fuel standard, putting in performance requirements and putting in some tradability. The reason that works is because it's more flexible. policy before used to be like, okay, we have a problem with market access. How are we going to fix it? We're going to fix it by saying you need to blend this much of ethanol and gasoline. You need to blend this much of a biodiesel into diesel. The new clean fuel standard, and I think every party has a version of something like this now, pretty much in what they've said they would do in an election, is let's be flexible. Let's look at how much carbon we need to take out of this to make it work. And then let's allow businesses to choose what fuel is going to work for them, what price point is going to work for them. And then, you know, from the producer standpoint, you can offer different options as well. So it's not subsidized and it's more flexible. And I think it's a more modern way of doing it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that background, Andrea. We'll get more comments from you when we get into the Q&A, because now it's time for something completely different. Steve Coupland is the Canadian Nuclear Association president with small nuclear reactors is one of the main things that we're going to be talking about. But isn't it amazing that we're talking about nuclear at all? Because it's kind of been pushed aside for the last number of years. And it sounds like it's making a comeback in discussions in quite a big way. So Steve, tell us a little bit about the changing environment of nuclear and why it is that we're now seeing it being taken seriously as a solution. What happened to change the attitude about this? And then we'll get into a little bit about the small nuclear modular reactors in particular.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Danielle. I mean, we're frustrated in the nuclear industry. For example, everybody talks about non-emitting sources of electricity, but they always seem to leave nuclear out of it. You'll know, the listeners will know that probably the single biggest reduction in emissions in Canada was Ontario shutting down its coal-fired generation. But if you listen to certain politicians in Ottawa and formerly in Queen's Park, they would have you believe that that was done by wind and solar. Now, you know, in fairness, wind and solar contributed, but 90% of the electricity needed to replace the coal plants came from Ontario restarting 6 of its nuclear reactors. So, you know, one of the answers to why nuclear is coming back is because we are, frankly, one of the 2 really large-scale non-emitting sources of electricity, the other one being hydro. And hydro, of course, has certain geographic requirements, whereas nuclear doesn't. And we have a small footprint and we produce massive amounts of electricity. For example, people probably don't know this, but Bruce Power, the Bruce Power site here in Ontario is in fact the world's largest operating nuclear plant. We produce about 6,600 megawatts off our site. In comparison, typical day, Alberta would use maybe 9,000 to 10,000 megawatts. So that kind of gives you the scale. And that's on a 2,300 acre site. And by the way, there's enough space on that site to add another 4-pack and another 3,000 or 4,000 megs. We don't actually have the demand or the transmission for it. But the point being the footprint, so you get a lot of power out of nuclear in a very small space. You also get, frankly, it doesn't take a lot of fuel to power a plant. We've supplied 50% of the electricity in Ontario for over 40 years. It varies between 40 and 60%. And the entire spent fuel would fill up about ice surface of about 6 or 7 hockey rinks. That's the fuel. And we obviously we know how to track that. We store it. It's well looked after. It's well managed. We know exactly where it is. So that's kind of why people are now looking at it, sort of saying, okay, electrification is going to be part of the solution, and therefore, how do you find large non-emitting sources of electricity? And that's part of why a large number of environmentalists have actually turned to look at nuclear as a path forward. So that's kind of where we're at. We have 19 reactors in this country. We supply, as I said, 60% of the electricity in Ontario, 30% in New Brunswick. What's happening now in our industry is the development of a next generation of technologies referred to as small modular reactors. It's advanced reactors. They are, as the name implies, smaller in size, both physically and land footprint. SMRs are defined as under 300 megawatts. A lot of the designs are in the anywhere from 2 to 200 megawatts, as compared to a normal reactor. I say normal reactor, existing reactors today, which are between the 750 and 900 megawatt reaction size, so significantly larger. These new reactors, they're enhanced passive safety systems. They are modular, hence that part of the name. They're designed and built in factories, and you know, some of the very small ones will be shipped fully fueled, all ready to go to a site and just sat there, and then frankly picked up and taken away afterwards. Whereas others will come in you know, maybe 4 or 5 components, but a much different design. One of the keys is actually a fleet approach to this. We have to think, the nuclear industry has to think of things a little bit differently to make the economics work, and part of that is a fleet. We went to the very large scale units, like I said, 900 megawatts, because obviously the larger the scale, the more revenue, and therefore the long-term economics. Nuclear is expensive to build, but very low price to run once it's built. So that's you know, we're revising how we look at things with a bit of a smaller fleet approach to it. So that's kind of, and then of course there are smaller staff and less waste, and as I said, passive safety systems. So those are important features. With respect to what, just to touch on what Canada is doing, we have something called the CEO SMR Forum. That's made up of 4 utilities, Bruce Power, OPG, and New Brunswick Power, which are the existing operating utilities that run nuclear plants in Canada. And the 4th one is Saskatchewan Power, which has indicated that it's planning to develop nuclear reactors as its SMRs, as it's one of its main ways to reduce its emissions. So we've looked at the technologies. There's about 150 different SMR technologies designs across the world. Obviously, first step is to try and put that down into some sort of reasonable focus. We've taken an approach at sort of really breaking it out into what we call 3 streams. Stream 1 is on-grid, relatively quick deployment. The first of a kind in this field is probably, well, the idea is to have it at the Darlington site, just outside of Toronto. We're hoping to have the first one operational by 2028. And that, of course, these ones are designed to be deployed quickly and to go onto the grid. So they're grid scale, grid size. Some of those designs, and it will depend upon which one is chosen, but some of those designs could also then be deployed off grid as well, depending upon the size, and for industrial purposes. Stream 2 is actually being spearheaded by New Brunswick Power, and it's actually what we call Generation 4 reactors. These are more advanced reactors, advanced concepts, with potential advanced fuel utilization, like using spent fuel, using some of the existing spent fuel. Stream 3 are very small or micro reactors. These are in the 2 to 10 megawatt area, and they would be sort of deployed for small remote communities, off-grid mines, off-grid industrial purposes. They could be applied to industrial purposes on grids as well, and you could simply scale them up. You know, some of the advantages we have, there are a number of mining sites that might take 20 or 30 megawatts, so you could easily scale up, you know, 3 to 6 of these and deploy a fleet. And the timeline for those, we're hoping the first of a kind is operational in 26 or 27. So you'll start to see deployment of those at the end of this decade. I know that's a few years out, but that's actually a fairly quick deployment for the nuclear industry. You know, so just a couple of words on sort of why we're keen on them here. I mean, obviously they're emissions-free, clean technology, reliable source of energy. We have a long history in the nuclear business. We were actually the second country in the world to have a controlled nuclear reaction in 1946 in the Chalk River area. So we've been in the nuclear field a long time, and we have a strong regulator, well-respected regulator, a good industry, a good R&D sector. A couple of advantages of SMRs is they actually allow us to get into the distributed energy game, which is something you don't do with a 900 megawatt reactor. But they can be deployed on industrial sites. They have the ability to produce high quality steam and heat, and they also can be used to produce hydrogen. So there's a variety, as well as obviously electricity. So there's a variety of uses for that. And of course, we have an abundance of fuel, uranium, here in this country. I should add, just as a side note, Cameco, which is the second largest source of uranium in the world, developed company in the world. The uranium that we export from, Cameco exports from Canada, avoids 550 megatons of emissions. So that's a pretty significant, it's almost as much as we emit as a country. So it's a pretty significant contribution I'd like to flag. One last thing, Danielle, and then I'll stop, is the CNA recently did a study, a modeling with Navis, which indicated that GHG, so using nuclear SMRs could reduce GHGs in heavy industrial sector by about 18% by 2050, which is a fairly significant reduction. But the other interesting part of that study was the modeling indicated that what it would also do is free up other technologies such as hydrogen or carbon capture and storage to go into other sectors, and thus sort of nuclear is more applicable in some areas, hydrogen in some, carbon capture and storage in others. So it all kind of work together to even make a larger reduction in GHG emissions. So then that study can be found on the CNA website. Quite an interesting piece of modeling. So maybe I'll just stop there, Danielle, and I ran through a lot of things. So you're on mute, I think.
Just going back to the idea so that people understand the terms that you're using. I thought you did a really good job of explaining how large your Bruce power plant is. It basically can cover essentially 2/3 or more of Alberta's energy use. But when you're talking about these smaller modular units, in the range of 200 to 300 megawatts, what is the kind of enterprise that would use that much power?
I'm not sure there's a single enterprise that would use that much power. Those in the 200 to 300 megawatt range, what we're talking about is going on the grid that would replace coal plants and stuff. They're designed 50 to 100 megawatt range, and those would be some of the ones that would apply. I mean, some of the in oil sands can use 80 to 100 megawatts of power, depending on what they are. Some of the large steel plants might use 40 or 50 megawatts. So, they can apply that way. As I use the example of an off-grid mine that might use 20, 30 megawatts, and you'd apply some of the smaller ones there. Most of the larger ones are actually would apply to facilities that are tied into the grid too, so they could strip some of that excess electricity off.
Perfect. One more thing, I thought I was just particularly tweaked on the fact that one of the models that you're developing uses spent fuel, because I think that's what people get hung up on. And you did a great job of explaining and putting into context the size. So I think you said 7 hockey rink size is how much waste fuel we have right now. But I think people have this aspiration. If we're going to try to get to 0 carbon emissions, shouldn't we try to get to 0 nuclear waste emissions? And does that new type of technology, does that provide a solution?
Yes, it will provide a solution, but you know, and we have the technology to do it. What we don't have right now, frankly, is the scalability, and frankly, we haven't necessarily got the cost figured out right now. So there is some long-term potential there. But I do think people need to, you're correct in that people worry about waste. And I think it's an unfounded, you won't be surprised I'm saying this, but it's a bit of an unfounded concern. We store our waste probably better than any other industry. We know exactly where it is. When it comes out of the fuel bundles, when they come out of the reactor, they go into a spent fuel bay, which for simple terms is an Olympic-sized swimming pool, because water is a moderator. They cool down there. We take them out and we put them into basically large concrete steel containers. They weigh 72 tons empty. You can store enough fuel in one of those containers to power Toronto for 2 months. And essentially, then they go into these concrete containers, and they're stored in essentially in a warehouse on the sites of the plants, which are well guarded, high security. But these containers have been, you know, of course, there's measurements around them for radioactivity, but they've been tested. I mean, they've done demonstrations of running locomotives into them, and there's nothing left of the locomotive, frankly. But we're stored in warehouses, safely stored, and the long-term plan is then to put it into a deep geological repository, which will have access, so we can at some point go back and get those fuel bundles, because there's a lot of energy left in those fuel bundles. So there's a great deal of energy still in it.
Fantastic. And that actually is a nice parallel with what we were talking earlier about. Can you turn carbon dioxide into useful products? And if you can't use all of it, then you can store it. So it seems like we've got some parallel there. Michael, it won't surprise you that, and I'm going to try to find questions that will go to all the panels. So I'm going to start with Michael and go all the way through. It won't surprise you that some people still do not support the Paris Accord, do not believe CO2 is a problem. It's become a source of income for too many scientists, says a lead. And too many climate activists and way too many politicians have no understanding of the energy issues. So maybe we can try to make one more stab at trying to convince those who are skeptical that we even need to do anything about carbon dioxide at all. So Michael, give your best argument, and then we'll go around.
Well, my best argument to this is that you know, being right is highly overrated. And I think, and I get it. Here's the debate is you know, what's the right numbers? Is 500, or is the right numbers 400 parts per million? But my whole point there is, I think the average person doesn't even know what a part per million is. So you're trying to have a debate with the public about parts per million when they don't even know what it is, and you want to prove, well, I'm right. You know, your 500 is too low, or your 500 is too high. And I think it kind of misses the point. But I also will say, let's just take that argument to its illogical conclusion. At 2,000 parts per million, CO2 starts to impact health. I mean, so CO2 is completely non-toxic, like water is non-toxic, but too much of it starts to hurt you. So at some point in that argument, you still have to say, okay, well, 500 parts is wrong, but at some point, hopefully we can all agree 2,000 parts is wrong. It starts to affect human health. And at what point in time, if it's not 2050 or 2100, it's 2200, we reach 2,000 parts per million. We got to do something eventually, right? So I would say, you know, take that argument to its illogical conclusion. But the main point, being right is overrated, is that we create a binary argument: do something, do nothing. And the people who are for do something have got authoritarian solutions, like the people with authoritarian longings. I think the consequences of losing the debate, even though let's say we're right at what 500 was the wrong number. The consequences of losing is we end up with an authoritarian thing. And guess what? Then we'll need the vodka because we won't double the GDP. We'll end up with a lot of trouble. We'll end up with a lot bigger problems, right? And so I would say, I think we have to come with market-based solutions. And the other final thing I would say is, I'm not just talking about CO2. We're talking about the overall environmental impact of 10 billion people with double the GDP. There's going to be more NOx, there's going to be more SOx, there's going to be more land impacts, there's going to be more impacts of all kinds. And if we don't come up with solutions that say, how do we produce the extra energy we need and everything else we need, plastic bottles, everything, how do we produce everything else that we're going to need with double the GDP with a lower environmental impact? So the people who come back and say, well, the emissions aren't important. Like, okay, but what about all the other environmental impacts? Let's talk about that too. And the final thing I would say is the risk of losing the debate is the cost is too high. We have to come up with a private market solution. And I think we just have to say, listen, every society can make up its own mind if it wants to invest in carbon capture or not invest in carbon capture. But as a producer of oil and gas, I want to be able to say to people, I'm willing to take responsibility for the impacts of my product. I think the example I've used for you, like General Motors doesn't sell you a car and then say, good luck with that, right? So I think the oil and gas industry has to stop saying, we're selling you this oil and gas, good luck with that. I hope you're right, it's not hurting the planet.
All right. Thank you for that, Michael. And I always find that when I have a person I'm really trying to convince, I just layer on the arguments and hope that one of them sticks. So we're going to do that here now as well. So Kathrine, what would you add to what Michael had to say for those who think we don't need to reduce carbon dioxide at all?
Well, from our point of view, I think our technology was founded on the principle that let's try to make hydrogen in a more efficient way, because I mean, regardless of believing and not believing, I think everyone believes that you should enhance or try to achieve the optimal efficiency in everything you do in order to save energy. So that was the starting point. Now, in terms of the CO2, I think that just a tremendous increase you see, and also that it sticks around longer than other heat trapping gases are the two key arguments why that has achieved so much focus. And I strongly support what has been said. I don't think we can afford to not listen to those arguments. So we certainly would like to be a part of the solution and not the other way around. So I think that's what we will focus on, trying to do our share, basically. And we certainly believe that this is a problem and that it is also an increasing problem going forward.
All right, Kathrine, thank you. Andrea, I'll go to you next, and maybe I can add an additional element to it, because some of the doubters are saying, yeah, but we're only responsible for 1.7% of emissions. Even if we get to zero, it gets completely overwhelmed by what's happening in China. And so is there this, how would you respond to the argument of it doesn't make a bit of difference what Canada does because we can't affect the global situation?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked Michael's framing of this as, kind of a false binary, right? Like it's either or. But, if we look at it also just from a business perspective, carbon is going to be a liability, because regardless of what we might think about, the Paris commitments, completely independent of Canada's relative size and contribution to global GHG emissions, some of our biggest trading partners, and frankly, they're some of our biggest competition as well, are going in this direction. So I think that there is a really, really strong case to be made for business resiliency here in Canada, looking at ways, for the private sector to be able to address carbon. I think it's going to be needed to compete with investment dollars around the world, right? I mean, like top investors are looking at carbon competency in their investment portfolios and making investment decisions based on it. Whether we like it or not, it's happening. On that argument, should we, will it make a difference? Is this really our problem to solve? I think Canada is a great example of, we have been relatively smaller in other global problems before, and we have sought to contribute to the solution with great results, right? Look at the impact that, we have been able to have. And, global conflict without the largest army, right? So I just kind of look at it from that way as well. We may have some opinions on, should we do this? Is it somebody else's problem? But carbon is going to be a business liability. We need to accept that if we are going to continue to be the country that we love, with the merits, and continue to be a strong energy provider, as well as I think looking at the opportunity cost of not doing something, like Michael kind of said, freaks me out, right?
Danielle, can I just interject there? This argument that Canada is too small to make a difference, I just fundamentally object to the very premise that Canada is too small to make a difference on anything. I really dislike that argument, because I think it's just the opposite. I think Canada is one of the largest producers of primary products in the world, which the world is going to need more and more and more as we grow GDP and population. And I think we fundamentally are in a position strategically to make a huge difference. And I'll just throw, we produce the lowest emissions LNG in the world. If we just replaced LNG from other countries with our LNG, forget coal, we'd make a big difference, because we have the lowest LNG in the world. But let's think about the difference we could make if we could reduce the 30% of the world's emissions in China with Canadian lowest in the world LNG. And by the way, we have some of the lowest emissions lentils in the world. Who knew that? It comes from Saskatchewan. We have the world's lowest emissions aluminum in the world. Canada can make an enormous difference, but I do think that we need to get away from this binary debate where some people are saying, Canada, reduce your emissions at all costs. Let's actually actively go and say, no, Canada is big in the world. We can make a big difference in the world, and we're going to do it. And we're going to do it by exporting more of what we're the world's best at. And part of that's going to be that we have the world's best consumption technologies for oil and gas. Nobody in the world's producing oil and gas more responsibly. And by the way, we're also going to make sure that you as our consumer can consume it more responsibly too.
All right, we're going to layer on with one more argument from Steve, because Steve, you got into the nuclear business for reasons other than carbon dioxide, although that's one of your selling features now. But can you talk about that issue of, if we can figure out small modular technology in Canada? We've already been a leader in this area, as I think you said, since 1946. How can we scale that up for the rest of the world? How can Canada lead on creating solutions that could be deployed elsewhere?
Well, there's a couple different areas. Michael, I was going to go into the natural gas piece that Michael just dealt with, because I quite agree with that. But nuclear is another piece of our resources that can make a big contribution. I mentioned earlier that our uranium that Cameco pulls out of Saskatchewan offsets about 550 million tons of emissions. We can actually, there's lots more. We have the richest uranium deposits in the world. We're limited by government, by our regulator, and by, frankly, our non-proliferation agreements and DFAID as to where we can actually sell that uranium. But we have the potential to make significant contributions to reducing it just through uranium. Now, in terms of small modular reactors, I mean, it's really a bit of a race. Canada's in a good spot, but the United States and Britain are spending, frankly, in the case of US, billions of dollars on developing SMRs with a view to deploying them. We're trying to develop them here, and there's a huge export market, some estimates of about $150 billion by 2050 in exports. And we have a technology, we hope to have a technology that can help solve that. And frankly, Canada has a pretty good reputation in the nuclear industry. If you go to the IEA, International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, ask them for the top nuclear countries in the world, the top nuclear regulators in the world, I guarantee you Canada will be in the top 3 of everybody you talk to. We have a good reputation. We're well respected. So if we actually can get our product ready ahead of some of our competitors, and some of that, frankly, comes down to government's willingness to help support first of a kind technology, but also to help us export that technology. then there's an opportunity for us to make a significant difference.
Let's then do one more round. We're at 11:10, so I think Troy wants to wrap up by 11:15, but I think this is where the market solutions have a real advantage over command and control, because I've got somebody asking the question, well, how are you going to force India and China to pick up any of these technologies? But I guess if that makes sense from a market perspective, they'll just do it because there's that kind of cost saving incentive to it. So let me start with Andrea first. And is there a market argument that you can make to nations like India and China about why they would want to look at your products?
Well, they're already looking at our products, right? So I think, you know, when you have products that are reliable and they are efficient and they're quality, and that's where we've got modern biofuels too, they're already being used. And I'll just add in as well too, you know, we focus a lot on the, you know, environment, the CO2 aspects of it, but from the fuel perspective, I mean, tailpipe emissions, you know, they're directly related to health conditions, asthma, breathing, respiratory problems. It's never been more exacerbated than, you know, a time of a global pandemic as well too, that's already, you know, a virus that's already attacking our ability to breathe, cancer rates. So, you know, that very much is, you know, a kind of a liquid transportation fuel specific thing. And I'll kick over the rest of my time to folks who are more on the emerging market side, but I think it's good precedent. The foundation is there. They're already using these when you have an efficient and reliable product with a value offering on health.
All right, Kathrine, maybe I'll go to you next on that front, because I do have a friend in the natural gas business who says that hydrogen just doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't I just keep burning natural gas the way I'm doing it rather than go through all the rigmarole of splitting it out, using hydrogen? It doesn't give me the same amount of energy, and then I've got an extra cost of dealing with the carbon. Can you make a case for that, about why the market would prefer your type of approach to traditional use of natural gas?
Yeah, and certainly, and this is due to the strong developments over the last few years, basically focusing on the environmental aspect of a product. So basically, you would have increased, you know, willingness to pay, I would say, for environmental friendly product. That is one, and then you have the carbon tax that now are being implemented and increased globally, and specifically related to EU and Norway. I mean, looking at numbers of up to 200, sorry, US dollars per ton of CO2 certainly changes the dynamics of the market. So suddenly you have a product that is eventually cheaper than what you need to pay, including the carbon tax. Now that many looks upon that as an intermediate solution. I think that perhaps it's necessary in the transition in order to get it you know, competitive towards current solutions. But certainly the end goal is for these new solutions to be competitive to let's call it fossil alternatives. And speaking about China and those types of market, they are an aggressive, I mean, I would say, look for new technologies in order to implement that in their countries. So that just eventually could be a fantastic market opportunities for companies developing these types of technologies. And just a brief comment on what was previously said about Canada. I mean, Norway is certainly a small country. We, you know, we hear that argument all the time that we cannot make any difference. But I think sometimes small countries are also, and Canada is not in this aspect, but such as Norway is a small country that can demonstrate concepts and proof of concepts because we are small. But that can be adapted in larger scale globally. And this electric car segment is certainly something that Norway has been a leader, I think, globally. I think we're the leading country now in adapting electric cars. 75% of new sales last year. That puts us at the top and basically demonstrate this concept and also, you know, becomes an important market for those that sell electric cars and as such can, you know, prove their business models. So I think everyone can contribute, small or large, and certainly Canada has a big play in this from my perspective.
All right, I'm going to give Michael the last word on this. So let me go to Steve, because you almost have the opposite problem where people are a little bit nervous about exporting nuclear. Does the argument change when we're talking about modular, because we've got nuclear powers with India and China anyway? Does it change the conversation about making nuclear more available in this form to those larger nations?
I think it will change the conversation. What's interesting about small modular reactors is it's got, China and India, for example, already have lots of nuclear power plants, and they're going to build more. But the where it's changing is there's a lot of developing countries that are looking at nuclear. For example, the United Arab Emirates. Now, they didn't build SMRs; they built light water reactors, but they built four reactors. By the way, most of the regulatory regime was set up by Canadians over there, interesting enough. But there are lots of other countries. There are countries in Africa that are expressing interest in it. There are other parts of the world that are taking a look at small modular reactors. There's a bit of an advantage too with small modular reactors in that, because of the size, they can go into a smaller grid. One of the challenges with large scale nuclear reactors, for example, Darlington, which has 4 900 megawatt units, 3,600 megawatts. I mean, it's not feasible to go into Saskatchewan, for example, because it's bigger than the grid, and and you wouldn't put all your power concentrated in one area. Whereas small modular reactors can fit. So that does open up some opportunities for sure. The only thing I would say that is a little bit frustrating is the government of Canada's approach to non-proliferation. And they limit what we can sell in terms of uranium to China and certain other places. And it's really handicapping our industry. And frankly, for no purpose. China does not need Canadian uranium for its nuclear weapons program, but it does need it for its civilian nuclear facilities. And frankly, it's just buying it from Kazakhstan or other countries as opposed to Canada, and we're hurting ourselves for frankly no reason.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Steve. I see that I'm getting the evil eye from Troy Lanigan, so that's why I strategically chose to end with Michael, since he's the sponsor. So I'll hand it off to you to just finish up. I mean, I think there's this notion that India and China or others need to be forced to adopt these kinds of technologies. You've been making the case for free enterprise as an alternative all the way through. I don't know if you've heard anything from the other panelists that you want to sort of jump off on, or if you want to make the point about why the free market would cause countries to choose it.
The one point I want to make that applies to every speaker here is that a lot of the argument for renewables is, yeah, okay, wind and solar isn't fully economic yet, and wind and solar hasn't solved all the technical challenges yet. But look how fast the technology is changing. We're soon going to have a battery breakthrough. We're soon going to have look at how fast the cost of solar. Look how fast the technology is changing. It's inevitable that it will be economic, even though it isn't today. Well, what's also true of nuclear and biofuels and hydrogen and oil and gas? Our technologies aren't static either. They're changing just as rapidly. I'd argue in oil and gas even more rapidly. So all of these energy solutions are all getting better. They're all getting more sustainable. And I think that's a good news story there, just the idea that technology is not static for anybody. And then the other thing I would say, like, I get there's some people saying, well, who cares if oil and gas is sustainable or not? Okay, great. I understand you don't care. But isn't it kind of cool that it could be? And that the technology is changing, and that we could, with a reduce, recycle, and return circular economy approach, make oil and gas a fully sustainable part of our energy diet, which means that we could make it part of putting the right energy in its right place, which we're going to need, because we're going to need all our energy choices for 10 billion people with double the GDP. And isn't it great that we have an opportunity to have a free market solution to that, as opposed to only having the option of do nothing or accept big government global authoritarian solutions? So that's where I'll finish.
Michael, it's a great point to finish on. I had Monica send a note earlier saying, you know, I don't normally watch video, but I'm so glad I tuned in because this conversation was excellent. Our excellent panelists are Michael Binnion, Modern Miracle Network, Kathrine Ryengen, who is with ZEG Power Norway, that's Z-E-G if you want to look them up, Steve Coupland, Canadian Nuclear Association, and Andrea Kent, former president of the Renewable Industries Canada. I'm Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group. And in addition, I should mention, I'm going to be going on to another climate change international conference this afternoon. It's called Climate SAN if you want to register and tune in. And I'll be taking a lot of what I heard today and putting that message forward on a different stage. So let me hand it off to Troy Lanigan. Thank you so much for hosting this today with Canada Strong and Free.
Danielle, if you want to put that link to your discussion this afternoon into the chat quickly, I please encourage you to do so quickly. I want to thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for joining us. Again, this exchange call will be posted to our website and our YouTube page within the next couple of hours. We'll be back next week, May 26th, with a second exchange call for May, getting to a fear-free COVID recovery. Special thank you to Michael Binnion and to the Modern Miracle Network, our sponsors. We are the Canada Strong and Free Network. If you appreciate the work we're doing, including these exchange calls, please consider a donation. Again, thank you for everybody joining us, and we'll see you on the 26th. Bye for now.